Welcome to the Nomad Futurist podcast, where ideas shape the future and visionaries redefine what's possible. Join us as we dive deep into the evolution of technology, society, and human potential, spotlighting the voices driving change and reimagining our world. Connect with us and join us at media.nomadfuturist.org. The future is a story we write together. Let's kick it off. Here are your hosts, Phil and Nabeel. Hello. Welcome to Nomad Futurist. This is your co-host, Nabeel Mahmood, calling in from Waikoloa, Hawaii.
This is your co-host, Phillip Koblence, calling from Montclair, New Jersey.
And this is Chris Moon from DigitalBridge, calling in from Larchmont, New York.
Brilliant. Chris, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. This has been something in the works to synchronize calendars across, seems like 3 different continents, but we did it. And I got to tell you this, man, you've got the best background. We've never actually had anybody on the podcast recording live from such a wonderful background.
The angle is, it's like we're interviewing a bird. It's just a sky.
I thought it was Leo, the 14th.
It's spring. Spring has sprung.
It's going to be 48 degrees on Saturday. Oh, has it?
Okay, fair enough. I haven't even looked at the weather, but maybe.
Well, it's beautiful. Well, lovely to have you here. Could you tell what you're doing these days to our audience? Or who is Chris Moon?
Sure. So about 6 years ago, I came over to DigitalBridge. I'd been in banking most of my career, and we started a debt platform, which we've now grown to about $2 billion. And the general focus for us is infrastructure debt provided to high growth and high capital consuming best in class businesses in digital infrastructure. So we are the only infrastructure debt fund focused only on digital infrastructure. And we do this with a team of 8 of us. We're all trained in digital infrastructure. We're all experts in the subject matter. And we believe that gives us an edge in the way that we go out and provide capital to these businesses that need it to get to the next level.
Brilliant. So I'm going to ask you a question. There's so many different definitions of digital infrastructure, people that are in the tech sector and people that are in the finance sector, or people that are in the marketing space. How do you define from a financial and digital infrastructure and the debt thereof?
So the primary areas that we spend time on, data centers, obviously, fiber networks, cell towers, small cell infrastructure. And then we look at a lot of businesses that also support those primary lines of business and service businesses. We look at a little bit of tech that may sit inside of a data center or rely on other kind of links in the chain in the areas that we look at. Primarily, we're focused on corporate loans. We don't really do asset-backed or project finance or sort of a lot of the types of debt that you might associate with traditional infrastructure. What we're really trying to do is find, and where we think the biggest opportunity for this is in the middle market, where you've got a lot of businesses that have the risk profile of mission critical infrastructure, yet you can still get the yield that is typically associated with corporate loans. So that's sort of the risk return mismatch that we're looking for. And most of the time, the businesses that we finance will exit into the securitization market or into syndicated loan markets. We try to bridge them from that stage where it's very difficult to identify the trajectory that they're on, but with the right flexible capital can get them to a point either of exit or refinancing that creates a lot of equity value.
You have all these fancy words. If there was a poster child for like finance bro in digital infrastructure, you have the amazing background behind you. You're smoking a stogie, right? Cigar Aficionado. You could be on the cover of Cigar Aficionado, and just the coolest guy in the room. Every time I've seen you in the room, I have to ask, as a child, you thought that you would be focused on digital infrastructure was going to be where you spent the crux of your career. Was that always something that was on the horizon for you, or did it just kind of manifest itself?
It definitely manifested. I initially was an education major when I went to college. I thought I was going to be a history teacher. That was what I really wanted to do. And then very candidly, I found out within the first year that what a history teacher makes and realized that wasn't for me. And so then I switched into tech and so started to tinker around with some of that, and then became very also interested in accounting and finance. And so I very quickly moved into that realm. I graduated in 1999. So we are in the heart of the tech bubble, or the tech boom, I guess, leading up to the bubble. So it was really hard in those days to not be just absolutely fascinated by what was happening in the tech world. Well, I guess taking a step back, I went to Northeastern University, which is a co-op school, which means you do a lot of internships as part of the program. And I was kind of all over the place. I was not really dedicated at this point to finance and accounting. I was back and forth between a lot of computer science courses, and I wasn't really committed to one track. So when it came time to place me for an internship, I didn't really have a great case, and I wasn't really on top of it either. And so by the time it came to my turn to find the match that I was going to go do my internship with, all the good jobs were taken and I didn't really have a lot of good prospects. So I was working at this nightclub and I was making a lot of money working as a bartender at a really popular nightclub in Boston. And it was paying really well. I was putting myself through school. And so I thought to myself, I was like, well, maybe I just won't do an internship for this period because I'm not going to put something on my resume that I don't really want to do. And I just couldn't find the right thing. So kind of about halfway through, we want a student that can join us for an internship. And they basically said, look, we don't have it. It's in the middle of the internship period. And there's no students available. And there was kind of a back and forth. And then at some point, the light went off that there was one student out there that wasn't placed. And I went and interviewed and started there full time out of school and was really focused on tech M&A. I was at the Boston office and I was there for maybe 9 months before the NASDAQ collapsed and kind of the market reset. So at that point, I was kind of back to the drawing board and it didn't seem like tech was going to be coming back anytime soon. So I then sort of pivoted to accounting. There was like the only thing you could find, and this is like in late 2000, really the only thing you could find was some of the big four accounting firms were hiring. And so I kind of just got randomly assigned into a group that was doing a lot of restructurings in telecoms. And
so let's pick it up when you as an intern after 6 months caused the internet to collapse.
Yeah. So I ended up in an odd turn of events. And it's not really what I was trying to do, but got a little bit lucky. Ended up doing an internship at Goldman. Then was part of the summer financial analyst program there, which is a great program. Got to see a lot of different areas of how the bank worked and really piqued my curiosity around a lot of the kind of elements of the financial markets and deal making. And actually it was there I really started to get interested in investment banking. And I thought that was going to be my career. And then the NASDAQ crashed and sort of all this scattered into a million pieces. So I got laid off after about 9 months and the whole market was just dead. No jobs anywhere. This is kind of late 2000. I'm in Boston at the time, so it's even harder to find something in finance. And I remember thinking I really wanted to go into private equity and a lot of the firms there wouldn't hire right out of school. So they'd tell me, you got to go to New York, you got to work in investment banking for a couple of years and then come back. So still couldn't find an investment banking job, especially in the tech and telecom area, which at this point is probably piqued my interest the most. I'm really focused on TMT. And so I ended up going to PricewaterhouseCoopers for about 9 months. It's the only place really hiring. And I was also really interested because they're seeing like the Enron stuff and WorldCom. And so I started to really think to myself on the accounting side, we didn't really cut in majoring in finance. I had a double major in finance and accounting, and we never really went into kind of what was really behind the numbers. And so I started to get curious about really understanding how to tear through a 10K and financial reporting and kind of what was behind it. So I did that for a little bit, all specialized in telecom, just kind of randomly was assigned to a group there that was working on a number of CLEC restructurings. And then finally got an opportunity to go to New York and work in a TMT group. And that was with ING. And so that was in 2004. So I came down to New York and hit it off with the guy who was running the team at the time. So the goal was I'm going to stay here for 2 years. I'm going to check off my experience and then I'm going to go back to Boston and I'm going to go work at one of the private equity firms up there and everything will be great. But there was just much to do. New York was so exciting. And then I started to really think to myself why I hadn't ever moved to New York in the first place.
As most people from Boston
used to
as I do.
Well, for me, so I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. And so you're kind of in between when it's like you either go to New York or to Boston. And so for me, I just always felt like Boston was much more manageable and then developed a very strong affiliation with all the Boston sports teams. So it seemed like I remember my uncle, who's a big Red Sox and Patriots fan, was just like devastated when I moved to New York. He couldn't understand how I would be walking around the office and talking to a bunch of Yankees fans. What was kind of funny about finance in New York in those days is that no one's more likely to run into a Cowboys fan or an Eagles fan than you would a Giants fan. I get down there and it was a lot of fun. We start building the team and it was a real scrappy team at the time. We really punched above our weight, started to do some really cool deal. And then I kind of just got caught up in that and I never really made the transition back. So we started, I think in 2006 was probably the first data center deal we ever did with Telex. And at the time it was like, there's going to be a little wave of consolidation and a couple of the telcos are going to spin these things out. And in 1 or 2 years, the whole thing's going to be over. And then it's back to radio station towers and cell towers and all the traditional kind of TMT stuff that we were focused on before. We were at a point where we didn't have, like all the other TMT desks around that time had a ton of media exposure. And we had almost none. And so when the financial crisis hit, we had a lot of capital where most of our competitors didn't. And we just really stepped on the gas with data centers. And then fiber followed not too long after that. And, I'd say there was less to do over time. There's a couple really active years with like Light Tower and FiberNet and FiberLight and all those kind of businesses that ultimately either got rolled up into Cron or into Zayo. But data centers was the one that I think that really I found pretty amazing, that it just every year you would get to the end of the year feeling like, okay, well, we've now done every deal that's going to get done in data centers. And then you open up January 1st, a blank sheet of paper, and it's like phone just starts ringing again. And you're out at 451 or Metro Connect or all the hotspots that we would visit and kind of drum up deals. And you'd be amazed by kind of how much more activity there was. And that's really the way it's been since for the last 15, 20 years.
Absolutely amazing story. So did you become a CPA as well, or were you a CPA
I did.
at PwC? Okay. What was the reason behind that? You're at this juncture at this point in time that the market is obviously not doing well, potentially even no signs of hope in 2003, 2004. Why did you not pursue that as a career path versus sticking with it?
I think I never really wanted to be a CPA, but they changed the rules around how many hours you needed. And as long as you could pass the test you needed, I think it was a 9 months or a year of work experience, whatever it was. I basically stayed there to get it. And then I left. And then I never really thought much more about that. To me, the action was always in investment banking. That's where I really always wanted to be. I wanted to be in deal making. I read all the Barbarians at the Gate books and was so fascinated with the rise of the private equity industry and the role that the investment banker played. And so for me, that was just really, really exciting. And then when I was at Goldman, I met a couple guys that were just so dialed into the way that they would control the client and manage the client. And there's one guy specifically I remember, we were sitting in a pitch and he sits down and the first thing the client asks him was, for this recommendation, his son had had this injury and wanted to get a recommendation for a knee surgeon. And after the meeting, the guy tells me, he's like, this is really the difference. When you can have a client that it's not when they just call you when they're looking for financial advice, or even when they're calling for financial advice, or bringing the whole firm and it's every different product, but it's not even just financial advice. It's life advice. It's where to get your knee worked on, where your kids should go to summer camp, all these elements of building really, really, really deep relationships and becoming the primary advisor to those key decision makers. And so I just thought that was so cool. And that was what I wanted to do. So I've always been kind of an originator focused on doing deals and finding deals. When you do that, you have to start with a little bit of a process. The best thing usually is to find someone who's doing it really, really well, and then you copy what they're doing. And that's what I did. And you kind of sprinkle in some of your own stuff over time. But I think one of the things that when it comes to high-end sales / origination / deal sourcing, it's all kind of the same theme. It's much more of a science than it is an art. And I think there's a lot of people that aren't as close to it, or they don't really understand it, that think it's like, okay, I just jump on a plane, I go to 451 and I just kind of schmooze around and I see what happens. And then I come back and then I just do it again the following year. I can't tell you how many people, you guys go to all the conferences, you see it too, where you'll only talk to that one person every year at that same conference. And you talk about a lot of life stuff and it's great with your great friends, but you're not really doing business and you're not getting closer to understanding what they're trying to accomplish. You're not really offering them advice on growing their business. You're catching up with them, which is great, but you're not really doing anything. And so I think the science aspect of it, and now we have tools like Salesforce and things that are really allow you to track it, to go in organized with a game plan and the ability to let the data dictate where you should be spending your time and where there is opportunity that translates into real deal flow is the highest level of it. And that's what I've been spending my whole life trying to master.
I think when we talk about this all the time, how so much of what we do is as much psychology as it is technical. I will say this just as an aside, the best 451 meeting I've ever had was on the plane coming back in 2013 when I was sat next to a hungover Chris Moon, which is the first time I ever met Mr. Moon, which we are on this call 12 years later as a consequence of that chance first meeting. So you always have to be kind of engaged. One thing I'm interested in, and I think it feels like when you got to Goldman and when you got to PwC in the city and you started to really kind of unearth and peel the onion behind the scenes of a lot of these telecom companies, that you were applying a similar curiosity of history that you clearly had as a child, wanting to be a history teacher as your main goal. So can we go back there? What was the driving force behind you wanting to become a history professor or history teacher? And where did that love of history come from?
I think it was just the stories. I remember in high school, my history teacher was just a cool guy. He's also my baseball coach and really resonated with kind of the way that he really dug in and understood the subject matter. And, there's a lot of the cliche and history repeats itself and stuff, but it just seemed like there was so much really interesting lessons about human behavior that just repeat over and over. And to me, I was always really excited and interested in the way that humans kind of interact with each other over time and make the same mistakes and build empires and burn them down. So when I first got into telecom, the first thing I did was read everything I possibly could about the history of how these networks were built. And actually, not to make a plug for Dan's book, but Dan Caruso just put out this bandwidth book, which is a great, perfect example of a culmination of all the networks coming together. And so stuff like that just always really made me tick, got me really excited. And I think if you really want to master a subject, you've got to really, really understand it inside and out. And I think what you often see, even with those that are branded as specialists, that their knowledge is very surface level. And so, when we first started covering data centers, I would go and do all the tours, and you'd want to understand the entire supply chain. You'd want to understand the customers, understand why the customers were using it the way they were, the history of the site, the history of the network. And to me, that was always really interesting, kind of putting that whole thing together and in a very qualitative way. I'm much more of a qualitative learner. And so I love the stories. And so I think that has really always drawn me to the history. And I still am. That's a great passion of mine. I do a lot of it still in the town that I live in. I'm the president of the Historical Society here. I do actually in my spare time do quite a lot around staying involved in that sort of stuff.
Amazing. What did your parents do? Is that where some of this passion came from? Were they teachers? Were they in finance?
No,
What was
I
that?
lived in Hartford. And the reason I lived in Hartford is because my mom was a secretary at an insurance company and my dad ran a paper mill in East Hartford, which along Connecticut rivers, where all the paper mills were built because of their access to hydropower. But yeah, he was kind of a blue collar guy and there's no connection to any of that kind of stuff. I will say my mom read a lot and she read a lot of history. So that probably rubbed off on me in some way for sure.
How about your siblings? Any siblings, and what line of work are they in, or what career paths did they choose?
I have a younger brother, Jared, and he's at MGH Hospital up in Boston. And he focuses primarily on X-ray and lab.
Your brother works as a technician at a hospital in Boston?
Yeah, so he's in the healthcare industry and manages a team. We were roommates actually for a little bit when we were there. We were in freshman English together.
All right, let's talk a little bit about your current situation. Kids in school.
Yeah, so I have two sons, Max, who just turned 14 a couple weeks ago, and then my youngest son is Cash, and actually today's his birthday. As soon as I wrap up here, I'm going to go to the school and be a surprise reader in his class and bring some donuts for all his friends. Then we'll have a little birthday party after.
Are any of them involved or interested in technology?
My older son, Max, is quite a bit. Last year, he built a PC from scratch and we went out and just bought all the components. He's watched a couple of YouTube videos and had a friend who did it. He's always tinkering around with stuff. Same I was as a kid, always trying to figure out how stuff works and taking it apart, trying to put it back together again. And then my youngest is just a jock. He loves Messi and wants to be a professional soccer player. He asked me the other day, how much do you think Messi makes selling the sports drink? Because maybe I'll just have a sports drink and that'll be my job.
It's almost like he's selling a sports drink. There's no Messi behind that. He didn't have to become the best soccer player on the planet in order to market it. But it worked for Logan Paul.
Well, Logan is Logan. So, Chris, question for you. Knowing what today, and you certainly have had a great career, I would say you're probably one of those that was potentially able to figure it out, having had the opportunity touching two different segments of the sector, computer science and finance. Knowing what today and where the market is headed, what would you do differently if you were to do anything different?
I'm going to say I would do anything different because there's probably a lot of ways in which I could have found a field where it wasn't as resilient or as exciting as the digital infrastructure industry has been. And I definitely didn't know that at the time. I think tech being the driver has been a pretty good place to be for a really long time. But when I was first getting into it, it was a mess. You're picking up all the remnants of all the overbuilding and the impact of all the bankruptcies from the CLEC industry. And so it was such an interesting time to cut your teeth during a really tough environment like that, because you're not going to make any money in those years anyway. And so I learned probably everything that I learned about credit in that first downturn that I worked through in kind of the telecom bust. And then probably the rest of it that I learned was during the financial crisis. So in a 4-year period, probably learned in a 20-year career, got to be kind of front and center when the tide was going out. And if you can understand the sector when the tide's going out, then obviously it's a lot easier to position yourself for when things are going better. So I don't like doing the, what would I have done differently? I would always replicate the philosophy that hard work is really underrated. Everybody says they're a hard worker, but that intellectual curiosity of really understanding an industry and really understanding something. And that's what I say to my kids. That's what I say to people that ask me advice about their career is if you're going to go into a field, really know the subject matter. Don't just know it enough to hurt yourself or enough that you can kind of get through a room full of people that have less background than you do. That doesn't really give you the position to jump on and capitalize opportunities where you see the sector moving. I heard Bill Ackman say this once, but knowledge and experience compound over time a little bit like money. So when you're doing that for 20 years and really looking in that extra one layer deep for all that time, when you look back, it's amazing how different the knowledge base and the network that you get from that and all the benefits that accrue and compound when you're approaching life like that.
Based on all of those experiences with the AI bubble or the boom that we have got right now, what are you projecting from a financial end, let's say 27, 28 and on? Are we going to potentially experience the same thing that we experienced in the early 2000s, or are we overbuilding?
Possibly. I think one of the things that I really like, and I've kind of made this little sidestep from tech to infrastructure throughout my career, right? I didn't stay 2 feet in tech. And one of the reasons for that is infrastructure, you don't really have to take a big bet on the technology. And so I really thought that was always pretty interesting, where if you're doing it right, you shouldn't build out ahead of the technology. That's what happened in 2000. I think if you go back, it's often unfairly treated in the way that the underwritings and the way people deployed capital, because it was probably a little bit more responsible than when you look back in hindsight. They were good contracts. They're kind of well thought out. They were long-term, they were getting the upfront deposits. They were doing a lot of the stuff that we do today. It's just that they were all completely exposed to paper valuations on the NASDAQ. And so that's one lesson that I've always thought about over time is, do you have an industry exposure, not necessarily a counterparty exposure, but are all these counterparties correlated to one event? And so I think now that you've got most of the AI spend driven by the hyperscalers right now, it doesn't feel too dangerous because they're all investment grade and they're very easy to finance. It's very easy for them to raise money, but it always plays out a little differently each time. So I try not to take myself too seriously around any predictions, or when anyone tells me they know what's going to happen, I tend to always try to take that with a grain of salt. I certainly wouldn't bet against AI materializing in a way that's vastly larger than what we contemplate today. And I think that's usually the way these things play out, whereas it takes a lot longer to get there. And maybe there's a few bumps along the road, but the ultimate impact that it has on society is usually very underestimated at the beginning of this kind of a platform shift, like what we're seeing with AI.
Look, I remember in 2000 or during the bubble bursting, there were all these articles that came out that asked, is the internet a fad? That whole thing was, what was that? That internet thing is going to go away. I think we've gotten way beyond the point of thinking that digital infrastructure is here to stay for the long term. There is no element of our professional or personal lives that doesn't necessitate digital infrastructure at its core. And that's going to continue to go up, whether it's at the pace that we think or not is a different story entirely. So difficult to argue the point that we are in an incredibly resilient kind of space, because there's just no element of life that doesn't touch digital infrastructure in some way. One final question that I have is, of all the things that you experienced, and I really appreciate the concept that you learn more through failure than you do with success. because you've experienced basically the ups and downs from both a financial and a kind of internet trend perspective, is there anything that really surprised you? Like at the time you thought it was going to go in a different direction and it didn't, or did even faster, or was it all kind of rolling with the punches as expected?
I think I didn't expect this fiber industry to consolidate as fast as it did. And so I think when I look back at those years where kind of Zayo was out, kind of picking up a lot of those businesses, that seemed to happen in like the snap of a finger. I think the data center sort of outsourcing timeframe and penetration curve was way longer. It seemed like it took a lot longer to consolidate that industry. And then if you go back to 2013, 2012, 2013, probably right around the time we met, you had like QTS starting to take this more real estate approach and looking at these bigger wholesale deals. And I thought that was crazy. I was both feet planted into the retail enterprise model. I thought multi-tenant co-location was really where all the action was going to be. And then I guess that's another way of saying that I really underestimated how fast the hyperscale cloud would accelerate. And it's almost like you look back and if you blinked, you could have missed it. But starting in that 12, 13, 14 timeframe, it just became like pedal to the metal for the hyperscalers and how fast they were building the cloud. I guess the other thing that I think about too is there's always a slower adoption curve to some of these things than you think. And I remember something that really stuck with me when I was looking at all these different technologies, and I forgot what analysis I was doing, but it was on some adoption of technology. And I was looking at like color television, and it wasn't until like the mid 90s that it hits like full penetration. And so we do a lot with fiber to the home right now. For example, we do a lot in some of these businesses where ultimately you're changing from an older technology to a newer technology, and it's on the retail consumer to do that. And I think you'll probably see that with AI, where the retail, the individuals will take longer to get comfortable with it and to really start playing around with it and using it in their daily lives, we think. And it's not going to just be a snap of the fingers, in my view. On the corporate side, I think it'll go really fast.
What would you tell your kids as far as the future is concerned and career paths that they should choose? We have a significant human capital deficit that we are currently in today. And the projection by 2030 is about 1.6 million people. That's neat. What do we need to do as a sector? And what would your message be to your kids and other kids around the world?
The first point of advice is always, if you don't do something that you love, you're never going to be good at it. So find the thing that you love and find where there's opportunity. And so I think one of the things that I've always looked for in my career is when I hear things like, oh, there's a huge deficit, there's a human capital deficit in an industry, to me, my ears kind of perk up because that says to me opportunity. The last place you want to go is kind of a market that's overcrowded. One of my sons said to me a couple months ago that when they grew up, they want to do finance. And I didn't discourage it, but to me, that feels like a very overcrowded field. It feels like that's thinning out. And by the time they enter the workforce, that's probably going to be a very difficult place to really distinguish yourself. And for the most part, in my philosophy, like if you can't stand out from the pack and if you can't create opportunity that's different than kind of just where everyone else is going to be, then it becomes very much less interesting. So do what you love, go where people aren't, and find an edge.
And don't go into finance because that's daddy's thing.
Brilliant. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. This has been great. So lovely to have you on the podcast. Great meeting you virtually, and I look forward to connecting with you in one of these events in person one day.
And you as well. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. All right.
Take care.
Cheers.
All right.
Thank you for joining us on the Nomad Futurist podcast. Remember, technology, markets, and challenges will continue to evolve, but those who adapt and prepare are the ones who will thrive. Embrace the change, stay curious, and let's build a future worth moving towards. The journey has just begun, and we are glad you are here with us. Visit us anytime at media.nomadfuturist.org to stay connected and be a part of the movement. Until next time, keep exploring.